We'll be starting the show in 1 minute. For some reason, my video is not working. We will start this in 1 minute. Give us 1 second. All right. Started a little rough, but we're here. Welcome to your next stop live here on Fireside. We had a couple glitches. Fireside actually just uploaded a new kind of version, which is amazing and awesome, but we were just trying to figure everything out. So again, welcome to your next stop live here on Fireside with Juliette Hahn. And I am really excited to bring this next guest, Clint Hatton. How are you?
We made it.
Okay, wait, I don't think I can hear you.
It shows the mic is on.
Okay, so get a little closer.
The mic shows on.
You're like really soft. Okay. Do you can we grab some headphones?
Is that any better? Okay.
It's a little bit technical difficulties. We're totally fine here. So you guys, I'm really excited to bring you Clint. His first book just came out yesterday, which is amazing. And so he's going to dive into his story, a pretty tragic story of how he started Big Bold Brave. You guys can see his website here, bigboldbrave.us. And Clint's going to get into the story. As I said, we're having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to bring the weight back up. And then we'll get Clint situated and started. Thank you, Mary and Susan. We'll be with you guys shortly.
The headphones that I had are not adaptable to this because I wasn't planning on having to go through here.
Okay, so I think maybe when your phone was down, it was covering the microphone because I could just hear you better when you just spoke.
Okay. All right.
There you are. We are good.
How about now?
Okay. Yeah, you're good.
Much better. Okay.
Yep, and I'll do. I'll actually change mine to this view as well. Thank you guys for being patient. See, sometimes live shows just they like to mess with us, which is understandable because that is the way. I mean, life doesn't really go the way we planned, and I know, Clint, we're going to get into that because out of all people, you know how that is. I was telling people when you weren't here, to follow you at bigboldbrave.us. You can also find Clint on all the socials, Clint Hatton. You can also find Big, Bold, Brave on all the socials as well. So Clint, and I love, hold on, it says Clint has to adjust the microphone. Oh, good. Yeah, we got that. Thank you, Gary. We have some people, if you guys are here on LinkedIn, whether you're LinkedIn, Twitch, YouTube Live, whether you're here watching the replay on Fireside or you're in the room, I know I've just had some people texting me saying I'm going to jump in at some point. We appreciate you guys being here. Again, my name is Juliette Hahn. This is Your Next Step live on Fireside with my guest, Clint Hatton. You guys can find him everywhere, but you can also go to his bigboldbrave.us. You are a first-time author yesterday. Am I correct?
I am. Yeah, well, I've been pre-selling it for a little bit, but yesterday was the official launch. So yes, we are off and running.
Yeah. So I would, if you can just get into, I want you were a pastor, right? A minister. You also, so you've been preaching for many years.
Yeah, I was until January. So now I'm actually fully in. I did that for 17 years. And now I'm fully in with my vision for Big Bold Brave, the personal development company, speaking and just finding different avenues to help a broader audience.
Right. And I know when we connected, we're going to be speaking, for 15 minutes. My listeners know I kind of do a little, let's see how our energies go. And then we kept going. And I was like, oh, wait, we need to stop. And as I was telling the listeners before, you have a pretty tragic story. And what came out of the story is this beautiful creation that you're creating. So if you can kind of, just start a little bit with your background, kind of where you grew up. That's what I always love to, have the listeners listen to. And then we'll continue with the story from there.
Sounds great. Yeah. Well, I grew up in sunny Southern California and spent the first 19 years of my life there. So just had what I consider to be a pretty average, normal life for the most part. Like you, I was an athlete, mostly football and baseball. So had a lot of fun with that, a lot of success with that. But then, things started to shift a little bit when I was about 12. My parents had been married for 25 years, and my dad ended up deciding to have an affair, which ended up breaking up the family for a while. It got pretty ugly. He moved in with this other person, actually, and her sons, which was, incredibly awkward for me. And during that period of time, my mom began to, she didn't know how to cope. They'd gotten married when they were 18 and 16 years old. They're from a different generation. So she had, suicide ideation, almost killed me actually twice when she was trying to commit suicide in a car and then once with a handgun. And so, that was when for me early on, life began to shift. At that time, I began to use all the wrong coping mechanisms, right? Because I was pretty angry. So I drank, I did a ton of drugs, and really, Julia, if it wasn't for sports, I probably would have went completely down the tubes. But I stayed, I stayed sober enough when I needed to be able to compete and succeed. So,
right.
So that was kind of the first real big bump in the road for me, was back then. But eventually, I moved on, and at 19, I had my second catastrophic knee injury playing junior college football, hoping that I was going to be able to get a full ride to a bigger school. And so my life just kind of went down this other path that I never planned. I became a professional salesperson, but I also got into meth. And so, during even that entire time, 9 years, I did hard drugs, I did meth. Although most people wouldn't have even known it, because I wore the suit and the tie, and, other than if you were with me partying, you wouldn't have known probably. But my life really went down, kind of a dark road. And then once I got to my 30s, that was when faith kicked in for me. And that was just a foundational thing that helped me begin to turn my life around. And then I'll just leave you with this last one, then we'll launch out. And then I actually joined a network marketing company. We've all been approached by one by now, right? And so I joined this nutritional company, and it ended up being that they all happen to be believers, but more than that, just the mindsets and the life philosophies just began to do something inside of me that I realized I was better than what I was showing the world. And so that's really when things began to really shift for me. And that was, when I was 31 years old. I'm 57 now.
Right. I mean, and so my parents actually got divorced when I was 12. They did not have a terrible divorce. It was kind of a lot of kids, just a lot of responsibility. They got married young, so it was like they were both approaching 40. My dad was just turned 40, and I remember it is a strange time. It's a strange time when you're all of a sudden like, okay, my life that I thought was going to be is kind of changing a little bit. And when you're a young person and your mind can't really grasp it, it's hard to then navigate. And especially seeing your mom go through what she went through, that had to been really, really tough. And so many people unfortunately do go look to numb it, right? You want to numb those feelings. You want to numb, you don't know how to do it. And so you turn to drugs. So when you found faith,
Yeah.
was it kind of an automatic, okay, I need to just stop drugs, or was it, a really rough stop?
No, that's a great question, and I'll point out really quick because I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to this. My parents actually reconciled a couple of years later, but that didn't undo the damage.
Right.
And I think they even knew at times that I was using bad coping mechanisms, but I don't know if it was just guilt, shame, whatever it was, but they just never addressed it. So anyway, that said, that's a great question because when I was about 30, this is just before I actually decided to become a man of faith. I was married before, so that's also part of my story. I was in a 5-year marriage that was just a complete train wreck. I was a train wreck. I was a terrible husband. I don't even need to get into her because I was my own issue. So, but we didn't do well together. And so there was this one night where we decided we both were going to go out and do meth one more time. And so we did. And Juliet, the next day I woke up and I felt like just garbage. And I realized I wasted so much of the night before. Anybody who's ever been in that world, a lot of times you spend hours waiting to get the stuff, and all that stuff. And I just thought, man, this is not how I want to live my life. This is not who I want to be. And so I made a decision that day. I was done, and I've never used since. And that was actually before I decided to, go to a church and have an experience with what it's like to live with faith. So it started before that. Now, I would say where the faith really began to change my life was not the drug addiction. It was really just, again, change my mindset about who I really am, what I was created to be, that I could really make a difference in the world. Because I'd always loved helping people. And for whatever reason, people would share the craziest things with me, just really intimate things. I remember one night we were doing meth and I was with a group of people, but they all left to go get more alcohol. And I was left with the wife of one of the guys, had never met them before. The next thing I know, she's telling me about how she'd been raped and all these different issues that she had never even told her husband, So for whatever reason, I was a magnet to that kind of thing, but obviously, not very well equipped to truly be much of a help in those days.
Right. And the reason why I asked you that is because it really fascinates me the way, there is an addict and people will say, oh, an addict can right. Some people don't believe like you're an addict. You can just stop, especially if someone can stop. Like I make my mind up, I stop. There's other people that truly can't. And for whatever reason, it's just the way their brain is wired. So it always fascinates me kind of, I think it gives a little insight into who you are, but also where your journey then takes you because of being like, okay, you know what? I'm done. I've lived life. I've lived a pretty hard life and now I'm done. And now I've just had enough, and so it's really important for people to also, you always say, okay, that rock bottom, that person should be now being like, okay, this is how much further can they get? And they find a deeper hole, which is sad, but again, I believe in God, but some people believe in the universe. Some people believe in both. I believe in both. I truly believe we all do have a path. And if we can just kind of listen to the cues or, maybe it was God being like, I'm going to make him really wait to piss him off and see what happens, or let's make this situation that happens. So, from there you decided, okay, I'm done. So when did then that first marriage end?
It really wasn't too long after. So, without getting in the weeds with my quote unquote salvation experience, I went to church one day with some friends because I just knew there was something different about them. It was really the only reason. They were very successful business people, but I noticed they always seem to have a calm and a peace even when storms are going on. So I went, and that's when I made a decision to follow God. Well, she wasn't too thrilled about that. And I just really knew at that time in my life, I really felt like I was called to do something inside of the church, which is something she just wasn't interested in. So it was only, I don't know, 8-9 months after getting a bunch of counseling. We went to quote unquote Christian marriage counseling. And just one day she decided to serve me with divorce papers and just said, this isn't where I want to go with my life. And the irony of that, Juliet, is, we had some really ugly fights during those 5 years. And I remember being angry for a couple of minutes because no one wants to be rejected, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember just this kind of calm coming over me, like, why are you so angry? Because our life was miserable. And we actually ended up having, for about 3 hours, probably the best, calmest conversation that we had maybe ever. And so we ended up following through with the divorce, and I went my way and she went hers. And that's ultimately what kind of led to me moving from California to Dallas and starting over.
Right. Which is, I mean, again, it's one of those things like yes, as you said, no one likes to be rejected, but it was maybe one of the best things that happened to you, because where it led you. So what did Dallas look like? What kind of take us through that part of your life? You're clean now, you're,
Right.
newly divorced, you found God.
That's exactly right. So, when I was thinking about making a move, there was actually 3 different areas that I was thinking about. I had some friends in Southern California that were doing some ministry that I was interested in. I had some in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then this network marketing company I was a part of, I had a couple of friends. One with my upline was very successful. She's one of the ones that was on the cover of Success Magazine, that kind of stuff. And they were coming to Dallas to build the business. But it was the one place I'd never been. And so to shorten the story, I prayed about it. I got counsel for some people, and it just, everything pointed to Dallas, even though that was the one place I had no reference point, no job. So I literally sold all my possessions, didn't have a job ready for me. And I moved with one of the married couples that was involved in that business. And we kind of had an agreement that we would stay together for 1 year, just to kind of help each other get involved in the business here and do what we need to do. And then we would part. And so that's what happened. But shortly after I got here, I just really felt like the network marketing business had kind of run its course with me. I wasn't really passionate about the business. It was more the, just helping people side of things. And I was really good at speaking in front of an audience and motivating people. So that's when I decided I'm just going to see what happens. And so it was really a total blind journey, with faith, I felt like I was making the right decisions, but there was no clear path. And then ultimately I had to get a job, of course I got a job right away, bought a new car right away so I could get around. And ultimately I ended up in the cellular business when it was relatively new. This has been, 25 plus years ago. Managed a pretty good sized store and just kind of waited to see, okay, I moved 2,000 miles away from everything I know. And now I manage a cell phone store. What is up with that, But after a couple of years of doing that, I developed some other skills and ended up going to work for a very large ministry at that time, one of the biggest in the world. And that kind of launched me into the Christian realm of ministry, if you will.
Got it. I mean that, and again, it is so funny where life takes you and makes you reflect, and sometimes you think about things that you went through and then you reflect on, okay, this is where I am. And sometimes I talk about this a lot on the podcast, when sometimes that unknown is like really what sometimes stops people, right? I don't know what's going to happen. So I don't want to push myself forward because I don't want to fail or I'm just nervous. And sometimes some of that unknown and what happens in the unknown is all of a sudden those two things come together and you're like, okay, I see you. I see you. I get it now. All that, stress I was doing, all this that I was doing. And then all of a sudden it was like, boom. Okay. That makes sense. I'm going to, move forward. So when you got involved in the ministry, what was your role? And then how did you grow there?
Well, 2 very exciting things happened there, because one of the things that I really felt was going to happen through this move at some point is I really felt like I was going to get a second chance at being a husband. And we did not have kids, so I wasn't a father yet. So when I went to work for this organization, I actually met my now bride of 20 years here in about a month and a half at that particular job. I was actually being interviewed to work in her department. And so two things kind of were all happening at the same time. Now that's a whole other story in itself. We could talk for 2 hours about our story and how we ultimately ended up becoming married, because it didn't happen quickly. It was about a 1.5 year long journey with a lot of twists and turns. But anyway, I go in and I meet her, and I'm thinking, there's something about her. And so then they start training me. So ultimately, I started with just being, this is going to sound smaller than it is, but I was in charge of book sales. Now, this particular organization, we did events. A small event was here in the United States with 20,000 people. We do Madison Square Garden. We do American Airlines Center, stuff like that. So I was dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of product. And then we would do international events as well. Biggest one I was ever a part of was about 500,000 people in one service. So, these were very large venues, very large events. But eventually I began to develop some other skills, did a lot of stage work as far as, hosting and, just announcements, things of that nature. Ended up taking on a whole bunch of things. Eventually they called me an event coordinator, but really I did all kinds of different things. I handled all of our radio, newspaper, print ad, promos for the events, things like that. Handled a bunch of venues. I was constantly working with, we'd have big time musical artists or other people who'd written books or whatever come in. So I was kind of the liaison for them. I was kind of the jack of all trades. When I left, they ended up actually giving my job to 3 different people, but I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. It didn't make a lot of sense. I was wearing too many hats.
Right. But you know what I love? I mean, so many different things. And we talked about this before, because I do want to have you and your wife on together, not just to talk about your journey, but then also to talk about, the tragedy that you guys had in your life, and then how kind of this unfolded, because we talked about that. So we will definitely get there. So anyone that's listening, they're like, wait, Juliet, why aren't you asking questions on that? Because that's going to be another show. But I do want to pause for 1 second, because anyone that is in this room, and Clint, you can do the same thing. I know we had some issues in the green room, but if you feel comfortable enough, touch your phone. If you go down to those 2 little lines at the bottom to the left, you'll see something where it says broadcast to the world. And you'll see, like, I have a little globe, like this is going live on, you can click this and send it to your friends. You can put it on Facebook. You can put it on, I believe, like LinkedIn. I mean, this is being broadcasted on those things, but you can also do that as well to kind of get some of your people that are not in Fireside. This is one of the things that I love about this platform. They can actually click that link that you're sending and listen to this whole show, even when they're not in Fireside. So that's what is this great, this great platform is all about. And now you're like, well, now my video is all messed up, but you'll figure it out.
Well, messed up, but only for a second here. I'm almost.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing is, though, also all of that you were doing for this ministry, like as you were saying it, I was like, oh my gosh, it's totally setting you up for what you are going to be doing now and what you're meant to be doing now because of how your life unfolded. And so it's really setting you up for growing what you're doing, which is kind of, it gave me chills, because I was like, oh my gosh, all that stuff is now exactly what you're going to be, what you have been doing, but now as it grows with your first book. So you met your wife, you're doing, this amazing stuff, your events and all these different things. You're really getting tools under your belt that are going to lead you to your next, path. So you guys get married, and then kind of take us into that.
Yeah. So when we got married, it wasn't long after that, probably about, 6 months to a year, she ended up leaving that particular organization. It just made a lot of sense for us. And so she actually ended up going to work for a medical facility that does some really high-end stuff with like the Mavericks and stuff like that, all these high-end physicals and those types of things. So she really enjoyed that. So, but then about 6 months to a year, this was the funny thing, Juliet, because we had made an agreement that we really felt like we wanted her to be a stay-at-home mom, but we were just too scared not to have the 2 incomes. Mm-hmm. And so instead we decided, well, we'll just find other ways to, do quote unquote God's will, because we felt like that's what he wanted us to do. And so everything's going well. This is a high-end facility. And after 1 year, they completely had to shut down and fire everybody except for the main doctor and a nurse. So we found ourselves, okay, let's give this a go. So she became a stay-at-home mom. At that time, I had the two boys, Gabriel and Joel. We hadn't had Liam yet. And so life began to, just kind of shift. We had really, struggle is probably too strong of a word, but it was tough because I traveled a lot. I was traveling around the globe. I was gone on average, a couple of weeks out of the month. There were stretches that could be much worse. There were stretches that would be a little bit longer in between, but I was gone a lot. And we didn't get married for me to be, jet setting around the world, even if it was for a good cause. We really felt like we wanted to do things together. So, as a couple, we prayed about that, what ended up being really a couple of years before there came a day where we just, really felt like, okay, that season is up. And again, I'm going to make the long story short. We had some really interesting things happen to kind of confirm that. And we were in agreement. So what was crazy about it was I really felt like the instruction I had received was I need to give my organization a 30-day notice, which that was no big deal because I was going to get paid for another 30 days. But then I felt like I was supposed to stay at home for 30 days after that and not even look for work. Now she's a stay-at-home mom, right? So that didn't make a lot of sense. But by this point, living a life of faith, God had already been faithful in our mind in so many dramatic ways that we're like, okay, let's do this. This is a little off the beaten path, but let's do it. So ultimately what ended up happening was, when you leave a job, any corporate job, and for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the church world in terms of, the internal side of things, you don't get a severance.
Right.
They don't pay you to quit, right? So this whole idea of at the end of 30 days, I've got to do nothing for 30 days and not make money was crazy. Well, 2 days before I actually had my last day, my boss, who was one of, there was 3 executive vice presidents that ran this organization that just had different roles. And by then we were really good friends. He came in, he goes, hey man, because I just want to let you know, I was able to go to battle for you and I actually got you 4 weeks severance pay. So I was just like, yes,
Yeah.
awesome. Cause we were leaving with 0, we were prepared for that.
Right.
But I really feel like, that decision had to be made in that space where we were jumping out in faith. And so then it got even crazier the next day, which was my actual last day. I'm doing the cake thing. I'm, hugging necks and saying goodbye to everybody. And he texted me. He was in Belgium, actually. He had to leave to go to a venue to check things out in Belgium. He texts me and he goes, make that 6 weeks. So now I'm like, hey, now I got my 30 days plus 2 weeks, that's pretty sweet, so that was cool. That was really cool. So what happened was, so now Juliet, I've got 30 days. I've been traveling all this time. And so we did a bunch of DIY projects together, painted walls and did some things and just hung out with the kids and just enjoyed life some. But then, 30 days comes, right? And the 30 days seemed like it lasted about a week, it was just over like that, And so at the end of 30 days now, I'm allowed to go look for a job. So, I felt like, again, I was called to ministry at that stage of my life. And I really felt like it was going to be in some sort of speaking role in some fashion, but I wasn't ambitious about that, So most of the jobs that I applied for were back into, the corporate world because I had been doing sales for so long. And then what happened one day was there was a particular ministry down in Louisiana. Now this is like 6 months after Katrina. So everybody can kind of remember how bad that was. It was a really awful situation. And I see that they're looking for a youth pastor. I was just looking on the website to just check up and see what was going on down there. And I turned to my wife and I said, hey, his name was Jesse Duplan. I said, he's looking for a youth pastor. Joking, like totally joking. Because it's Louisiana, Katrina. We live in North Dallas. We're loving it. We just bought a new house, just a couple years before. And she goes, well, shouldn't we let God decide? And I'm like, oh gosh, okay, yeah, whatever. Sure. Yeah, we could do that, because there was 0 risk. Nobody knew me down there, and plus by now I'm like 40 years old. Who wants a 40-year-old with, a youth pastor who, by the way, has never even been to a youth service in his entire life because I didn't even, get involved until I was in my 30s. So I literally got my resume I prayed over it like you might bless a bowl of cereal, right? It was that intense. And then I just hit send. I'm like, okay, I did my job, thinking
Right.
nothing of that and just moved on. Well, everybody's already probably guessed where this story's going. So ultimately, they contacted me. We ended up feeling really honored that they wanted to talk to us. So we flew down, they flew us down, and we ended up going on staff at this church. There was just such great need. There was a lot of hurt people, many who had just literally lost loved ones and lost everything they owned. I mean, it was just,
Mm.
it really felt like we could go down there and do some good. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring that part up is because I just left you with this whole idea that I had a 6-week severance, right? So another part of this was when I got hired by them, I really felt, once again, I got very unusual instruction. This has never happened before, never happened since, to not even negotiate my salary. So I literally started doing the job and didn't even know, one, if I was even put on the payroll yet, let alone what that paycheck was going to be. Don't recommend that, but that's what I did.
Right.
And so this goes by, for a couple of weeks. Now, let me point out really quick that 6-week severance that I was given was not paid out in a lump sum. It was paid out over 3 pay periods. So one day they fly me down. I'm going back and forth literally because we hadn't found a place to live yet in Louisiana. So I'm driving down a couple of times. I'm flying down, and they fly me down. They pick me up at the airport, and the senior pastor says, "Hey, by the way, I just wanted to let you know we already put you on the payroll, and I have a check for you." Oh, I'm like, "Hey, that's great,
Wow.
great.
Right.
I'm getting paid. I don't know what, but well, here's what's crazy and why I shared that story. So what nobody knew other than me, because I'd never told them that I had a severance from the other, organization, is that the last of the 3 paychecks from that organization, I received the same exact day that I got the
Mm.
first paycheck from the new organization. So, God just kind of worked it all out, and we never even missed a single day. So it was a pretty amazing time of our life, a lot of challenges. Louisiana was a complete disaster, and yet, God was moving.
Right. Now, so I know you said you had bought the place in Dallas a few years ago. So was there kind of thoughts, okay, we're going to rent Dallas out to see how long this is and how this works, or we're going to just sell it and, just jump in with 2 feet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we did wrestle with that. Now you got to understand the timeline. If everybody's going to do the math here, this is 2006.
Oh.
2007. We know where the housing market's about to go, right?
Yeah.
But when we made this decision, we didn't know that yet, And so we ended up actually deciding, well, let's just lease it out
Hmm.
and we can hang on to it and we'll end up having a passive income. And, that was the idea, right? The hope. So we did. Well, that was part of why I said there were some really great things happening. And then there were some great challenges. The people that ended up moving in were people that we knew the wife for many years. She was relatively newly married, didn't know him so much. And it really, on paper, looked like a real win-win situation. Well, we had no idea, and even she didn't know at the time how bad their situation was because he was hiding some things. Literally the first month, Juliet, they were over 3 weeks late making that payment.
Mm.
We're youth, young adults pastors, so we weren't, exactly raking it in. And so it became somewhat of a nightmare. And it actually got to one point where they weren't able to pay us for over 3 months. So it was tough. It was a really tough time. We could have sued them. We could have done a variety of different things, but we just really felt like we still needed to somehow keep that relationship intact. So eventually, we said, "Hey, you have to move out. You just have to. You have to go find somewhere because you can't pay us." And so that's what happened. And we ended up short selling the house. We got some help from family to kind of offset the cost of that. And so that was really, really tough, because when we went to Louisiana, again, post Katrina, anybody who was down there at that time would know this. There was almost no housing.
Right.
It was very difficult. We couldn't even find a place to rent. There was nowhere to rent unless it was in a place where, you probably want to wear a flak jacket every day you get in and out of the house,
Right.
So,
And
yeah.
how old were the boys at this time?
Yeah. So that was Gabriel and Liam were roughly 5 and 2. So they were
Mm.
very little, very young. And so we ended up having to buy a house in Louisiana. It was the only way this whole thing was going to work. And so that was a blessing at the time too, until we get into '08 when we wanted to sell this thing in the housing crisis. And then we went through a whole other series of disasters with short sales. So real estate was not our thing back in the 2006 or 2008. But we moved and we had a beautiful home on the bayou. I actually was just joking with someone not before we got on this call about seeing alligators every day and that never getting old. So life was good. We were doing what we felt like we were called to do. There was challenges, tough stuff, but there was also blessing in it.
Right. And also, thinking about where you came from in California and the South are also very different, maybe similar climate, but very different values and how people kind of do things. But so, I mean, and the kids being 5 and 2, so the oldest will have, had memories like, okay, this is interesting, but I'm watching mom and dad kind of do this and grow something. And as you said, there's some excitement, which is, always, it's fun for kids to see, like, this is like good stuff. So how long were you guys there? I mean, I think you said you sold in 2008. What kind of took you away from that?
Yeah. So part of this story and how we ended up there, my senior associate pastor at the time of the church when we were still here in Dallas, who was really my mentor, he was not so thrilled when he found out that I had suggested or had accepted rather a position down in Louisiana. And I had no idea that they had been working behind the scenes to find a role for me here. It wasn't a pastor, which, I wasn't driven to be a pastor, but I just didn't know any of that until I had already committed to this. So I left that behind. And honestly, we were good with that. We knew we were supposed to go to Louisiana. But after a couple of years, what ended up happening was he ended up taking over a church in Seattle, Washington, or near Seattle, that was part of the family of the church here in Dallas. It was autonomous, but they were related. And so he took that over, and a couple months into that, which was, latter part of 2007, asked us if we would just come visit, and so we did. We took our own time, vacation time. We went and visited, and we just all felt like, wow, we're supposed to be here with you now. This was like a dream come true to help them build something because they were our mentors, So we ended up doing, everything right. He contacted the pastors and founders of the church we were a part of and had a great conversation and, just said, listen, these are our, spiritual kids, if you will. And so keep them as long as you need them, but let's start moving towards, helping find your replacement. And so we did that. We were there for a little while, waiting for them to, make sure that they were in good shape. We didn't just leave them cold. And so they ended up hiring who they wanted to hire. And next thing you knew, we were on our way to Seattle this is the crazy part of that story, Juliet. So, the time of the year now, houses aren't really selling right this minute. So we just packed everything we could into our suitcases and moved to Seattle, leaving the house staged, all the kids' extra toy, everything was there, hoping that we could somehow sell that house in the next couple of months. And that didn't happen. It ended up being almost 2 years later, actually, that we finally was able to short sale that house. So it was a total disaster. But we ended up in Seattle under that premise.
Right. And so now were the kids still 5 and 2, or was now this like a little bit more?
Just a couple of years. So now we're talking probably 7 and 4. But this is when shortly after, we'd only been there for maybe about a year. We were done. I don't know if, you guys have ever been through this part of it, but we had the first 2 and, we had suffered through a miscarriage in between Gabriel and Joel. She has not responded well to pregnancy ever. Gabriel was actually born at 6 weeks early. And he was about 3 pounds, 6 ounces because she got severe preeclampsia. When Joel came along, he went full term. We escaped that. But then after when she was trying to go in to deliver him, because she was stuck at 2 for like 12 hours trying to do natural delivery, the epidural wasn't working. They didn't know what they were going to do. Eventually it finally took. But then when Joel was delivered, I was in there with him and he's healthy and I'm excited. Next thing I knew, they pulled me into the room because they actually wanted my help. She wasn't coming out of the anesthesia. And so that went on for several hours. It was very scary. Everybody, had that. The doctors are obviously very professional, but everybody had that look of concern that this is not going well. So after that, we were done. Yeah, like we're done. Two's good. Two's a nice even number. We're done. But about a year into living in Louisiana, I could see it. She's picking up babies and
Yeah.
holding
Well,
on to
yeah, when babies get to a certain age, I mean, it's really funny because we have three and they're all 2 years apart, a little less than 2 years apart. The last two are like a little, like, 2 months older than 2 years apart, whatever. But I always wanted to be a mom. Like I knew I wanted to stay home with the kids. I babysat from a very young age. I love children, especially babies. And so I remember, and our delivery was not great. We got pregnant right away. We were very fortunate, but then like I was late with every single one. I had emergency cesarean for, the first, then I had a crazy recovery. And, the second was a little bit better, but the doctors were like, it's really not. And I'm like, but it wasn't the first. So it's definitely better because of this. Third was better. But even when I was pregnant, I was not a nice person. And it's so crazy because and not tooting my horn, I'm a pretty nice person. I have a pretty, I have a lot of energy, good disposition. I'm a kind person. When I was pregnant, like all of a sudden my husband would be like, I think you're pregnant. And I'd be like, oh, let me go take a test. Cause I've just became people when
right.
my first, I stayed home after the first, but like when I was pregnant, I was obviously with the first, I was working. And I remember them being like, you just became like scary. I just became really short, had no patience for anything or anyone. It was really insane. So when my husband's a little bit older than me, not much, like 4 years. But I remember saying like, let's do like after like literally our daughter came and I was like, okay, I could do this again. This is amazing. And
Oh
he's
my
like,
gosh.
yeah, no. So then we ended up, we have two dogs. But I remember at that age, like when they became like, 7 months to a year, it was not at 7 months, like a year to 2 years. It was like, oh, I miss like that newborn, like
Right.
baby. And so it's just something inside. I think some people I have had friends that were like, oh, I hated that stage. That's like the worst. I love when they're like, 12 and 13 or, whatever. So it's just very interesting. So you could feel that she was like, okay, holding the babies and like, oh, I don't know if I'm done.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, and to her credit, I was lucky. She did not turn mean when she was pregnant. She just broke a lot of stuff. When she started breaking things, glasses and dishes, I'm like, uh-oh, you need to go, you need to go get the stick. Something's up, but anyway, so what happened was I'm watching it, and she didn't push it. She didn't really, much say anything about it, but you could just see it. And so we ended up eventually having a conversation, and my heart had kind of softened to the idea. So we decided to, let's see what happens. We'll try for the girl, right? We got two boys, whatever that looks like. I still don't know how you try for that, but we're going to try for a girl. And so that didn't work either. We didn't create another girl. We created a boy. But what happened was for 6 months, it seemed like things are going pretty good. I mean, she's had the normal sickness that you get and morning sickness, stuff like that, but nothing serious. And then quite literally, I'm leaving one morning because all this time has went on and our house in Louisiana is just not budging. And we'd lived there now for over a year with nothing more than what we had put in a suitcase. And so we decided I'm going to go down. We're going to load, I'm going to work with movers, load the house up. We're going to lease a place up here and we're at least going to normalize our life. And whatever happens with the house happens with the house. So literally I'm leaving the front door to jump on a flight from Washington to Louisiana. And she's like, yeah, I don't feel the best today, but I'm okay. I'm like, okay. Well, I'll call you when I get there. So Juliet, that's like you can't fly direct, or at least in those days, from Seattle to New Orleans. So it took me about 8-9 hours of travel time to actually land there. So by the time I got there, it was early evening. I get in my rental car. I start driving. I call her and I said, how are you doing? She goes, things have really turned bad. She was already at a hospital. Her blood pressure had skyrocketed to, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like 220 over 100 something. I mean, it was just really bad. And she's telling me they think they want to take me to this special hospital with an EQ unit and that I may have to give birth tonight. And I'm just like, oh my, you got to be freaking kidding me.
Right.
Here I am. I just landed, So literally I drove to a Walmart on the way to our house down there to just grab some quick supplies, told her I would call her when I got there. And by the time I arrived to the house, things had gotten even worse, and they were definitely going to transport her. They were planning on giving her a steroid shot, which was really more for would end up being Liam than her, because now, she's only at 27 weeks,
Right.
So ultimately, I was in Louisiana until 7 a.m. the next morning. I arrived at like 7 o'clock at night and was on a flight at 7 a.m. Took me all day to get back, but I got back in time. The steroid shot did its job. It bought us 48 hours. And so that's really because obviously at 27 weeks, you're not really anywhere close to fully developed and ready to come out of the womb, but that gives you a better shot with your lungs and your heart. So
Right.
I get back, and about a day after I get back, they're like, it's time, because by then she had slipped into full blown HELP syndrome, is what it's
Mm.
called. And so that's when literally your major organs are beginning to shut down. And if they don't take the baby, you're going to die. And of course, the baby could die too. So they shuffled us into a room, and it was just, I was actually at the head. They had a screen, so I didn't see the hard stuff going on with the way they were trying to get him out, because he was stuck. I mean, it was just a nightmare. He was stuck. They couldn't get him out.
Right.
And so they pull out this baby, and he was 1 pound 14 ounces. So
Oh,
it just looked like this little alien. I mean, I don't mean to be crass
no,
about
we're
it. Just
totally.
what it
Yeah.
looks like. It doesn't look like a baby. And so they throw me into the specialty unit where they put him in this special cocoon, start hooking up, all the different devices he was going to need to survive. And, I had to leave her in their hands. So it was pretty traumatic. And
Yeah.
this is what kind of began our journey of, having our third child. And I don't know how far we want to go with the story. Obviously, he's 13 now. He's done really well. He's a black belt martial artist. He's tough as nails. That worked out for us. But these are all stories, that ultimately I think lay a foundation for, at least in some ways, to be able to handle what we face today.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. I was just literally thinking, gosh, we could really talk for about 5 hours. And I know in the beginning of this, show, I had said, what you guys have created out of tragedy. And I'm sure people are thinking that this was the tragedy, and it's not. As you just said, Liam is a healthy 13-year-old boy. So you guys are now, though, and we don't need to go into this part. But people know when you have a baby in NICU, I mean, you're in there, you can't bond. There's, I mean, so many different things that you guys had to go through. Your wife had to go through as her hormones are leaving, and that's, tough. I've had friends that this has happened to. And it's a really, like when your breast milk is coming in and there's so much stuff that your body prepares you as a mom. And then for it to be taken early, your body just goes through, and your mind, everything just really goes. So, I mean, remarkable that your wife, it obviously came out on the right side. But the one question I do want to ask is, I mean, when this is all going on, you now have also, you're older too. So how old are they when?
Yeah. Yeah. So at that point, let's see, Gabriel had to have been about 8 years old, and Joel would have been about 5. And so, and
Right.
actually, let me add to it based on what you just said, because there's so many layers even to this story. This was also during the H1N1 virus, which we don't remember that quite as well, just because of how devastating COVID was. But the rules, everything was pretty much the same. So for 2.5 months, every single day, we had to go down. Well, we didn't have to, but we obviously wanted to go see him. But we were the only two. No, the boys couldn't meet him. The grandparents, aunts and uncles, nobody but the two of us could even see him for 2.5 months that he was in the NICU. So there were many times that Gabriel and Joel, literally, we'd go down there with them, and they'd sit in the waiting area and just sit and try to keep themselves occupied while we went and visited with Liam for a couple of hours and delivered milk. And that's a whole other issue, because as you said, her
Right.
body wasn't producing like it would have if it had been longer. And so there was just, there was a myriad of challenges that went along with that.
Right. I mean, and as we, anyone that's joining just now, we have Chris Hatton on. He is the author of Big Bold Brave. You can find his website, bigboldbrave.us. You can also find him on all the socials. Clint has had, did I say Chris?
Oh, don't
No, I
worry.
said Clint.
Chris, Glenn,
No,
that
but did
happens
I?
all the time.
No, but
You
all of a
said
sudden I was like, wait,
one
did I say Chris or did I say Clint?
say Chris one time, but it's okay. I knew you
Oh
were
yeah,
going to
okay,
correct
sorry. Yeah, no, I was like, wait a second. As that came out. But so Clint has had, I mean, you've lived kind of for about 15 people. I mean, from where you were as a
me.
child, parents getting divorced, then your drug use until 30. I mean, and you know, first marriage, meeting your wife, finding God, you know, going to a ministry down after Katrina. I mean, there's so many different things when someone puts this out. And this is why stories really connect us, because there's going to be people that are listening to the story that are going to connect with different parts. And I always, you know, I'll have people, clients, podcast guests that will say, like, well, my story is really not that big of a deal because of, you know, they'll hear someone's story like yourself and they're like, well, I mean, I've just, you know, I had to, like a little thing over here. But it doesn't matter how big someone's story is. And I love the big, bold, brave, because I think that's not just for the tragedy that happened in your life, but I think that you've kind of lived a big, bold, brave life your entire life, and then bringing your wife into it as well. I think it's really important for people to hear and also understand that just because their story is not as tragic or they haven't had as many layers, right? There's the layers part, doesn't mean insignificant. It's happened to you, and that is important because what happens to you shaped you to be a certain person. So, you know, Clint, it is, you have had so many layers, and we haven't even gotten to, you know, what really kind of connected us as well.
Can I
But
say one thing to that, Juliet? You know, because
please,
I'm glad you said that. You know, people may think this sounds strange, but that's how I always saw myself too, really. You know, I know there, I mean, when I sit back and I think, if I write a list, wow, that looks like a lot, you know, but I didn't feel that way, you know, over the years. I didn't see myself as this person who's been through all this stuff and all, you know, had all these either just really difficult challenges or in some cases a tragedy. You know, it really wasn't until, you know, more where we are today that in my search to help people, and we don't have to go there yet, but I just have realized, you know, gosh, you know, I guess I really do have a lot of different experiences that I could really have empathy and compassion for people and be able to help them. But I'm only saying that right now because, yeah, comparing stories is such a bad idea. There's
mhm.
nothing, you don't need to compare it to anything. I hear all kinds of people's story and I think, oh my gosh, I haven't been through anything, you
Right,
know?
right. But that's, I mean, again, you know, universe, God, God was preparing you for, you know, what happens later in your life. Because if you didn't have some of the other challenges, and this is just my opinion, but you know, and I think when people, if something really tragic happens and they've never had anything happen in their life, it
Mm,
takes them down. And again, this is just my opinion. I just feel like it takes them down. And I don't want to say more because that's not, I'm not saying that you know, haven't been taken down and suffered, but I just think that it is different. And so I do want to touch on, so when your youngest was in the NICU, did you
mm.
have any of those experiences where it was like, we don't know if he's going to make it? Like, how many times did that happen? Or, I mean, I'm sure he was born at 1 pound. So
Yeah.
if you could take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, really too many to count. And I don't say that for the sake of being dramatic. It's just
No,
anybody who
right.
experienced this, you know, they hook up, you know, all the different devices because what's happening at 27 weeks and up until, you know, you're another couple months down the road, their brain is still learning to communicate with all of the major organs. And so one of the scariest things that happens is something they shorten it by calling it a Brady episode. There's a medical term for it I won't try to pronounce. But a Brady episode is just simply when the devices that they have hooked up pick up on the fact that they're forgetting to breathe.
Mhm.
Like literally, their body just doesn't even know to breathe because there's not that constant connection between the brain and lungs. And so what happens is this bell will start going off, you know. And back in those days, I used to call it the bell from hell because, you know, every time that thing went off, which was several times a day, every day.
Mhm.
And then, of course, this was a huge NICU unit as well. So it was actually the biggest one in the state of Washington, which was good in some ways because they were set up for it. But you also had like 50 other of these, you know, cubicles around the space, and so you could hear other people's bells going off too. So, you know, it was really stressful. But that bell would start going off, and you're just like, okay, come on, come on, come on. And I don't remember, how long you could let the bell go. It seemed like way too long. But
Right.
what would happen is if he didn't self correct within a pretty short amount of time, then a nurse would come over and they would nudge him through plastic gloves, because he was in a isolated container the entire time, just trying to rouse him. And of course, he did. But yeah, it was frightening every single time that thing went off. There's always something in the back of your head. Is this it?
Right. And and I have to say, this is going to sound so random, but I babysat when I was 12, 11, 12, 13, around there. Our neighbors were two twins, and they were preemies, and they came home with that bell. This was, I mean, they're in their 30s now. So they came home with that bell. And I remember my family lived right across the street. The mom, and I mean, they had just gone through this ordeal, right? They were exhausted. They just wanted to have one night out. And they're like, they're strong enough. But if that bell goes off, you
Yeah.
need to really, and it was Alexandra, really, that was the one that was a little weaker. And I just remember I was telling someone that story. Her head fit in my hand, and they were like, wait, how old were you? And I was like, now listen, I have a lot of siblings. I was really good with kids. My mom was literally right across the street. But these parents were like, we just need a night out. We just need a night out. We trust that you're going to do it. But I remember I talk about that bell, and I don't recall if it ever went out. I feel like it did go off, because I remember being like, a kid being like, I'm not going to even sit down. I'm just going to stare at these little, little
Yeah. Yeah.
birds. I used to call them little birds, and I'd be like, I'm going to call them, and if it went off, I would be like, okay. Oh, okay. Okay. I mean, and so this is obviously, they were in the NICU for months and months. They were strong enough to go home, but they still had those bells. So I remember those bells. But being a parent, I never had to, go through that. So, I mean, you guys went through that. When did he come home? And if you can take us through that story before we then, continue on.
Yeah, so that goes on for quite a while, and so it was about 2.5 months later. He needed to get to, oh, my memory fails me a little bit. It was like 4 or 5 pounds, so it was still very small. But there
Mm.
was there was a marker that he had to reach. He finally did, and then we also, just like you described, they sent us home with the device to monitor with the bell. I don't remember him having it once we went home, because he had pretty much stopped doing it by the time they sent us home. But I do remember taking it home and hoping that,
Right.
now we're at the house. We're a 35-minute drive from the hospital. This thing better not go off, right?
Right.
But, we went through that. And so by then, of course, Joel and Gabriel meet him for the first time. So that was exciting. But at the same time, it was really tough. And
And
so,
exhausting. I'm sure you guys were probably
well,
exhausted.
yeah, we were. And, this is not really a rabbit trail, but this was just kind of our life at that time. I had taken on other roles as well. So I was the youth, young adults pastor. At some point in time during the 7 years that we were in Washington, and most of this was after Liam, I led pretty much every department except for accounting at some point. So there was all this responsibility too, and you're feeling guilty because, obviously your priority is to your bride and your baby. But at the same time, I don't want to let everybody down. And so, we were kind of dealing with all that stuff, and Amaryllis really couldn't help. I mean, all she could do at that time was recover and nurture Liam the best she could. So that was all going on. I actually, we don't need to talk about the book right now, of course, but in the book, I actually talk about collaboration, because what ended up happening during that was kind of beautiful. And I think it speaks to, even as a family, what you're alluding to, that I think is true, that there were things that helped us develop some muscles for even
Mhm.
harder things. I realized that, okay, I'm a bit of a control freak with certain things. I need to just release my team to just run with things and not have to, bypass so many things off of me. We need to collaborate on a greater level than we ever had. I need to just trust. So all that was mixed up in this too. And that ended up changing my life, because
Right.
by the time we got to where we really could come back, which was, a few months, before I could really come back into my role and truly have the full capacity again, I no longer needed to do any of those things, because the leaders that we had, which were all like young adult age, were just killing it. And frankly, they didn't need me to do a lot of the stuff anymore that I thought I had to do. And so that even became true with, Gabriel and Joel, even though they were pretty young, they were doing stuff around the house and helping mommy out. And, we worked more as a team to kind of get through it. And so even though it was a hard time, it was pivotal, and it was really something that I think, in the long term helped us tremendously as a family unit be able to handle the gut punches of life.
Right, which I think is really true. So, okay, so he comes home, you guys are in Seattle. When did you then move back to Texas? And so
Yeah,
I know that there's going to be like a space because we're going to go from when they're like 10 to then, how you created this, your whole coaching and your
yeah.
book.
Well, so Liam did really well, for 2 years while we were still there. Because when we had him, we were there for almost another 6 years, like 5, 6 years. They had always predicted, doctors saying this could happen, that could happen. We had to go meet with a doctor, like actually 4 doctors on a regular basis for like 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Aced everything, never had any kind of the cognitive speech issues, any of that kind of stuff. So life was really pretty stable for several years there. Ultimately, what ended up happening, Juliet, is that we were up there for 7 years. Now, your listeners already know now, I'm from sunny Southern California. We spent years here in very sunny Texas and sunny Louisiana. And my wife is Puerto Rican. She was born in Puerto Rico, didn't move to Florida until she was 12, and then she was in Florida.
Right.
So the gray, the gray and mist just began. It was like waterboard treatment to us, right? It was just like this constant thing. And so that honestly was a huge part in us just desiring that, plus all of our family, really was between Texas and Florida. We still have beautiful friendships to this day in Washington, but we just felt like we want to go back. So we had a lot of conversations with the pastors that we worked for over the course of months, just to, again, make sure that this is the right decision at the right time. And ultimately we came to that conclusion. And so we moved again blindly. So this was another one of those, we didn't have a promise of anything coming back here to where we live here in McKinney, Texas, which is just outside of Dallas. But we knew we wanted to make that move. And so we did. And so you'll laugh at this, because by now we've got 3 kids, right? And I think I'm not quite 50 yet, but I'm getting close to 50 at that point. So we had to move in with parents for 2.5 months. And listen, now they, my father-in-law is a pretty high level pain management physician, runs a very large facility. So they're financially very well off. And so space wasn't an issue. They had tons of room. They had a big house. But you don't plan in your late 40s with 3 kids to move back home. It's just not really on anybody's goal radar, right? And so that went on for like 2.5 months. We really thought, like, with our experience and with our old church, which now had spread out over 5 different cities, that something was going to happen really quick. And it didn't happen that way. And so we spent 2.5 months, kids going to, new schools, and my father and mother-in-law are amazing people. We're very, very fortunate. So we do have a good relationship, but it still created stress.
Right, totally. And it's the unknown, but also I think about what a great experience for your kids and the grandparents, right? They get to be together in this really wonderful kind of time, which,
maybe a little too much.
Right.
You are right. It was beautiful, but then it was just, Liam was little, Joel was still pretty little, a lot of energy. It was a lot for them to take.
Right. 3 boys. And when people always say boys, my daughter was, I think, more active than even the boys were. So I hate that stereotype, but if you have an active kid, it doesn't matter if they're a boy or girl. Yes, generally girls sit in color. None of my kids did. I didn't. We were not that type of family. We were up and moving. So we were always running up and down the hallway, or, running this way, jumping on here, jumping there. So, right. So it was a lot of energy for your in-laws.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for us, you didn't want them to break anything, just all that stuff.
Right.
So, but, a couple months go by, and eventually, the doors opened up for us to actually go on staff back with the church that we were originally just a part of here in Dallas, only at their McKinney campus, which is right where we wanted to live. So ultimately those things worked out. And so we started a new journey, here. And so that journey, went on for about 5 years. And, The boys were doing well. They were thriving. It was during this time that my oldest son, Gabriel, his passion for aviation really began to kick in. I think he was about 8 when he went up in a plane with his Uncle Danny for the first time, and it was like, I don't know if you're this way, but I've got to have my morning coffee. I mean, it's like, that's my meth now, I mean, it's like, I've got to have it, and that's kind of how it was. He went up that one time and I was like, I've got to do this, so amazing. That was all happening during this time too. And I don't know if we want to jump into that part of the story yet, but ultimately,
yes. Yeah.
So by now, things are moving, going well. Again, life is pretty good, and everybody's healthy. Liam's healthy, Joel's healthy, Gabriel's healthy. So Gabriel starts high school, and at 14, he enters an aviation program. He's a 9th grader. Now that's pretty unusual. There's really only a couple of school districts in the country that have a 4-year aviation educational program.
Right.
So again, this is another one of those things where we're feeling like, oh my gosh, how fortunate are we? How blessed are we that this worked out, and for us, God knew this, and this is amazing. That same year, he joined an aviation club. It was called Tango 31 Aero Club. That's simply, it's a small club that was created by a guy who, has been in the aviation industry for decades. He's kind of a salty old guy. I love him to death. Some of your listeners actually may know who he is because he's actually famous. And
yeah, he's clapping down in the audience here. One of the listeners is, and I got to get close because they know Radok, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Radok. He's clapping, so he's I think he knows.
You may know where this is going. So his name is Kevin Lacey, and where your listeners may be familiar with him is he was one of the stars of Airplane Repo, which was a show that ran on, I know, Discovery Channel. I want to say it was on something else as well. So he's pretty well known, but he wanted to help kids. He wanted to help. He always had to work for everything, so he wanted to help teenagers dream and become pilots or aircraft maintenance if that's what they wanted to do. So same thing, this freshman year, another just amazing opportunity opens up, right? It's like he's absolutely certain he wants to be a pilot. So we begin that. Everything's good. And then by the time he's 16, now you have to earn airtime with Tango 31 through sweat equity. So they're literally doing oil changes, and eventually, as they get more skilled, they're doing engine maintenance, and they had new planes brought in pieces and putting planes together. I mean, it was really an amazing thing.
Yeah, really.
So he was one of the founders of it, one of the founding members of it. So he became a leader, and so he got opportunities to start going up with a flight instructor, which was totally free, totally free, by the way. Kevin set this thing up to where we literally paid $50 a year, and he had free flight instructing. They got their fuel for wholesale cost. I mean, it was just an incredible blessing, right? Opportunity. Right. So he's 16, got skilled enough before he even had his driver's license. He soloed, which I remember we were both there. We're filming it, and because we're probably going to start talking about fear now, right? There's fear layered into different parts of my story that I had to overcome. He gets in the plane. He takes off for the first time by himself. And I mean, it's kind of like, one of your kids who's an athlete, if you're an athlete or whatever, you got that nervous energy, but you're just so excited because you just think something great's about to happen, And so he gets up there and I'm just thinking, man, this is amazing. And then it hits you. He has to land this thing, Right. And I remember excitement shifting to like almost terror. You're like, oh my gosh, what have we done? He's going to have to land this thing. And so it was kind of scary too. And his very first landing, he comes down and just, as he liked to say, like butter. He just landed so smoothly, So he was on his way. And doing really well. By the time he was 17, so, here in the States, you cannot earn a private pilot's license certificate until you're 17 years old. So he had to wait until he was 17, studied the exam, the book, anybody's ever seen it. It's like, our old phone books back in the day in LA that were about 8 inches thick, and he passes the test first time out and then the written. And then he takes the check ride, which is probably the most intense in terms of just nerves, aces it, and he becomes a pilot.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it had to been such like, for you to have really struggled to find yourself until you were in your 30s, to be like, wow, this is pretty remarkable that my kid, and also feeling good about yourself. Like, these are the roots that I've given him. He's seen us travel around. He's seen us, find different things, be in different states. I've given him those opportunities. Your wife and you've given him those opportunities. And to be so like, this is what I want to do, had to been a very, like, as a parent, like, oh my God, I'm really proud. I'm proud of him, but also a little proud of myself that like I've helped him kind of nurture this.
You'll probably relate to this. I was mostly proud I didn't break him.
Right. 100%. 100%. Yeah.
Because a lot of it, Juliet, not to discount, I feel like we definitely had done some good things with our kids, and we've always taught them to dream big and all those things for sure. But I really felt like, with him, he was such a unique personality. I mean, even from very early on, 4 or 5 years old, his communication skills were incredibly strong, like too strong.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one thing once they're teenagers and they think they know everything and they can communicate it. When they're only 5 or 6, it's kind of like, what?
Right.
What are you saying? So we had some of that, always thought he would be a CEO because he had to be in charge of everything. Like, we just knew he's never going to be able to work for anybody, And then the other thing was a lawyer, right? Because he loved to argue, and facts didn't necessarily get in the way.
Oh, I think we lost you for a second.
That I so admire even now as his dad, some that I didn't even fully appreciate, to be totally honest with you, while he was still with us. He was just adventurous. He attacked life. If he wanted to do something, he taught himself how to play guitar. He wanted to learn guitar. He didn't even know he was doing it. When we're sitting in the living room and I hear this, and I wish I could remember the song. It was like Led Zeppelin or, somebody. I hear this guitar riff that I'm, familiar with. Looked at her and like, did you hear that? She's like, yeah, that sounded live. I'm like, it did. So we go to his room and he's in there jamming on this electric guitar. We're like, when did you learn guitar?
Right. That's so cool.
Well, and you'll laugh at this because this is our kids today. Like, there's so much, I don't know. I'm not going to overgeneralize for everybody else. They're so much braver and more intentional than I was at that age. He's like, oh yeah, YouTube. I'm like, oh my gosh,
Right.
So
Well, he definitely had a like forward thinking kind of entrepreneur, like, which again, because of your background, not really kind of finding yourself and clean of drugs until you're 30, that just had to been also like a little bit of oh, this kid is fascinating. Like, I'm fascinated by him. He gets his pilot license. He's 17. How many times would he go out by himself? Like, were you guys always like, okay, I want to be on the airfield somewhere, or like connect, or like, was it like pure freedom?
Yeah, we let him be free. We let him be free. Just to back up just one tiny second, I think the other thing throughout the years that we did, especially when you start talking about my story, is I didn't hide that from my kids.
Right.
My boys know my story. They know every little detail of my story. And so, they were always aware of where certain decisions could lead you that would be very positive, and, things could lead you down a different road. And so, so he chose a lot of good decisions, some not so good. He also liked to drive too fast, but he did. He started flying. And once he started soloing, at that point, it's really just about hours. So he got his license. He's just getting hours. He's doing well. Kevin and all the guys that kind of surround that with the flight instructors are just super impressed of how well he's doing. And so that ultimately leads us to the night of September 23rd, 2019. So by now he's about 3 months shy of his 18th birthday. Again, it's all about the hours. So he had a mom of one of his best friends reach out to him here in McKinney and say, hey, listen, are you willing to take her to Arkansas today? Because she was attending the University of Arkansas, but here in McKinney for, of all things, a funeral that weekend. And she said, can you take her up there so she can miss a lot less classes? And of course, he's all gung ho.
Right.
It was going to include night flying on the way back, which is, some of what he was needing to train in. And so that was very normal for a pilot. So he did. He took her, and, thank goodness they arrived safely. And he dropped her off, said goodbye to a few other friends that were going to school there. And then he jumped back in the plane and headed home. He had just started a brand new job the day before with a friend, and that friend's dad. He was loving it, just He had just started taking some classes too because he graduated a year early. Just I mean, life was just everything was right there, Juliet. I mean, it's
Right.
just he's living the dream, literally. And on the way back, he got about 20 minutes from Fayetteville, where he took off and ran into the NTSB is the one who does the investigations on all plane crashes. It would take us 2 painful years to get the report. But what ended up happening was he encountered an unexpected weather system going through a mountainous range there, and he ended up losing his horizon. He suffered from what they call spatial disorientation.
Mm-hmm.
Your listeners are familiar with that, even if they don't know the term. Kobe Bryant's wreck,
Yep.
globally famous, right? Exactly what happened to his pilot who had, decades of experience in a multi-million-dollar aircraft. It can happen to
Right.
anybody at any time. And it did. And he and
Mm.
he crashed and he lost his life chasing his dream.
Now, yeah, I mean, I have a 17-year-old, so I just, again, all the life, excuse me for getting emotional, but all the life that you had lived, with almost losing the baby and then, almost losing yourself, your mother, like so many different things. And then now seeing this kid that has, again, we all make mistakes, but like living the dream and I mean, being at the top of his life, the top of his world, and then his life being taken from him.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine, and I hope I never have to. No, I hope I never have to. But when did you guys find out? So was he supposed to be home at a certain time, and he didn't call in, and then you kind of think, well, what's going on? How did that
Yeah.
unfold?
Yeah. Well, so what happens is, Kevin, his mentor, tracks any of the pilots because there's some other kids that were flying at that time as well. So he tracks them on an iPad device. So what happened was I had actually went out to run some errands. Don't even know what they were. Came back to the house about 8 o'clock in the evening of the 23rd and saw my wife on the phone. And there's just something innate in all of us, right? When you just see your spouse or a relative or a friend or whatever, and you can just tell by the tone of their voice and their facial expression that, oh my gosh, what's going on? So I see this look on her face, and I'm like, whispering,
Right.
what? And she ends up kind of mouthing, "It's Kevin." And so, my heart just kind of stopped because that was not normal. That was
Mhm.
not standard operating procedure.
Right.
So I'm half listening to her side of the call and recognize that something obviously had happened. So she hangs up, and he went off the radar. Kevin could not track him. He was not answering his cell phone. Now we would later find out shortly after that where he did crash was in a very remote area that had virtually no cell phone coverage. So within 30 minutes to an hour, that wasn't necessarily the worst news. Like that didn't mean that he was not okay.
Right.
We just knew he went down somewhere and nobody knew where he was.
So because you hear people that have lost a loved one or something has happened, that they have sometimes this feeling like,
Mhm.
okay, no, this is a bad feeling, and or something has happened. Did you guys have that feeling?
Not early. And, because you asked the question the way you did, I'm going to back up and give you a little bit of background from that morning because it's something, Juliet, honestly, I still can't totally wrap my mind around of what it meant.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened the morning of, this is long before he ever, took off. I used to walk a lot in those days. This is before I started getting into, back into weightlifting and HIIT. So I'd walk like 10 miles a day. I was walking all the time. Went for a walk that morning. And as I was walking along, we've all experienced this. You can describe it different ways. You can call it, really vivid daydream, or you can call it a vision, whatever you want to call it. I was walking past a golf course, and then all of a sudden, like, all my surroundings just disappeared. And I was just in my imagination, if we could just say it that way.
Yeah.
And the scene was playing through like it would in a dream, but I'm walking. And in this state, whatever it was, I'm running around my house. I'm back in my house. And I'm running around the house, clearly in a panic of some kind. And I run out the front door and I go to we have a very close neighborhood here where we have very close relationships with our neighbors. And I was running across the street to go find two of the ladies that we live across the street from. so that I could have them take Joel and Liam because I had terrible news to give Amaryllis about Gabriel.
Mm.
Now, in this, I didn't see anything about what that or even boom, as fast as it came. Next thing I know, I'm aware of my surroundings again. And I'm walking by the golf course still. I'm thinking, wow, that was really weird. And, when something like that happens, Julie, I don't think too many parents are unique. We all have fearful thoughts. We all have
Right.
crazy we dream or just randomly think about. So in the moment, I just thought, oh no, fear,
Right.
I am not going to give
Right.
any fear. And I did. I said a simple prayer. I remember doing that of just protection over him and our family. And
And did you know he was flying that day anyways? Like, so could it have been, sometimes if we know, and I do this and I hate sometimes that I do this, but like if my husband or my kids are going somewhere, I like, will be like, okay, what if this happens, and then I have to push it away because I know that they're going on this journey. So you knew that he was going on this journey or did you not?
well, he was flying almost every day.
Okay.
So I don't remember if in that moment, I remember I wasn't thinking about he was going to be in a plane crash. That was for sure. I just,
Right.
again, it didn't show me anything, but the only reason I'm sharing that is because that happened. It
Right.
happened. And so fast forward. So now, we're into the evening. We're about maybe an hour into knowing that he went down and a series. Now, again, Juliet, this is a very layered story that went on for several hours. So I'm just going to give you highlights or lowlights. But ultimately, I'm making a phone call to the sheriff department that was in charge of search and rescue because I want to make a personal contact with him. So I did, and they're telling me there's no cell phone coverage. We cannot confirm anything, even though there was a news network from Fayetteville because we were tracking that on our phones. I think it was ABC or NBC local that had reported at least the crash. I'm like, well, how do they know about the crash?
Right.
They're like, we can't tell you anything. Okay. So an hour or two goes by and, we're doing everything that we know to do at that point. So to answer your question, we were still holding out all hope that we just couldn't reach him and that
Right.
he was okay somehow. And so we prayed, we declared scriptures, we turned on worship music. I mean, we did all the stuff that, if you call yourself a person of faith, that you feel like this is what I need to do. We did all that stuff and really felt like somehow, some way, there's no freaking way our story can end with this or have
Right.
this in it. Even though we'd been through stuff, it's like this can't happen.
Right.
So we stayed, uh, confident that that was not going to be what happened.
And how old and the boys are
Yeah. So now Liam is 9, Joel is 14. So he's now a freshman in high school, and they are asleep in their bedrooms and have no idea what's going on.
and as brothers, are they like super connected, close? Are they, just
Hmm.
normal? And what was there, if you can just give us a little
Yeah.
insight in their relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Gabriel and Joel are the closest. They're only 3 years apart. And they were like sibling mortal enemies until about 6 months before this night.
Mm.
They were just constantly fighting, and Gabriel would bully him and, all that stuff. But then, about 6 months before, give or take, they actually took a trip. They would take an annual trip for spring break with the grandparents, the same ones that we lived with for a little while.
Mm.
And they took this one trip where they went up into the mountains. They own a cabin in North Carolina. Gabriel could drive at that time, so they're driving a Jeep, and they became buddies.
Mm.
It's just their relationship, the tone of it, the way they treat each other, just dramatically changed like over a weekend. And
That's amazing.
so by the time this night happened, they were buddies. They were buddies.
Mm.
Now Liam, of course, he was 8 years younger than Gabriel, so they definitely had a good relationship, but there was a very different
Very
relationship,
different. Yeah.
very different. And Gabriel, by that time, as I've already described, he's going to school, he's at the airport a ton, so he's in and out a lot. Liam doesn't see him all the time,
Right.
so that was a little bit different.
Right. Oh, so right. So they're sleeping. They have no idea. And then when did you get the confirmation that, he had passed?
So it went on throughout the night, and there was even nuances to that, because I began seeing reports from the news that would have just a little bit more information. And I'd call the Washington State County Sheriff back, and they would still say the same thing. We don't know how they're getting information. There's no cell phone coverage, blah, 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 blah. Then about 1:30 in the morning, actually about 1 a.m., I was again looking at my phone, and I saw that the local, and again, forgive me, but it was ABC, NBC, whoever,
Yeah.
reported not just the crash, but a single person fatality.
Mm. So that's how you found out.
Not yet exactly. I'm pausing because this part gets me.
Right.
And my heart sank like you can only imagine unless you've been through it. And I'm sitting right next to Amaryllis on the couch. We were on the couch at that time. And it was in that moment, the reason why I paused for a moment, it was in that moment that I remembered this crazy thing earlier in the morning.
Right.
And I just remember thinking, Julia, it's like it's hard for me not to want to cuss right now.
You can cuss. You can curse.
Are you freaking kidding me? Is that what that was all about? That I'm talking to God at that point. It's like, are you preparing me to have that conversation? And all these crazy thoughts are just going through my head, but I'm looking at this screen that says my son's dead. And I was devastated. I sat there for what seemed like forever. It was probably really only a moment or two. And I just remember turning to her and saying, baby, he didn't make it. And we went through hell. As you can imagine, we sobbed and snot coming out of our nose, and as much as we could to try and keep it down so our boys wouldn't hear it in their rooms. And it was incredibly painful. And so before I told her and I saw it, I did immediately text my mother-in-law, her mom, and my father-in-law, who same grandparents I've been talking about that live about 45 minutes from us. They had been up doing the same thing, tracking what they could track. And I told them, you need to get here now. So they were on their way.
Yeah.
Well, about 1:30. So now this is about a half an hour after this has taken place, and we're just, crying our eyes out because we think it's over. I get a knock on the door, and I go to the door, and it's two fully uniformed City of McKinney police officers. And of course, we've all seen, if we've never experienced it, we've all seen a movie where something like this happens, right? So I'm thinking, oh my God, this is it. They're coming to give me, the official news. I step out, and the night just became confusing again. Quite literally what happened was they pulled me out, and they started asking me for my contact information because they wanted to be able to give it to the county sheriff, who I'd already spoken to 3 times at this point. And every single time before I ended the call, I had made sure, again, this is Clint Hatton. Here's my phone number, blah, blah, blah. Turns out they didn't know anything other than there was a crash, and they were only at my doorstep at 1:30 a.m. to get my contact info. So I was pissed. I was pissed. I was confused. I'm like, what the heck is going on? Why is the news reporting this? And you guys all act like you don't even know what's happened. So I made another call,
Right.
and they're still telling me, we don't know where the news is getting their information. We can neither confirm nor deny anything other than we do have people on site. So at that point, Juliet, we felt like, okay, maybe it's not over. Maybe there's still a chance. Maybe they're wrong, So we went kind of back into that. We just started praying again. And, at that point, you're willing to pray anything you can think of. So we're even praying resurrection. If he's dead, bring him back. You're in that place as a parent at this point where you're just praying the most extreme things you can think of because you don't want to go through this,
that had to been, just right. And again, we hear things of the news does this, the news does that. And the anger, because now the emotions that you must have been having must have been insane. I can't even imagine. But also as the husband, the man, all those generalizations of, trying to make sure that everything is okay, that, your wife's okay, but you're trying to struggle with this. I can't even comprehend. I mean, it must have been such an outer body experience.
Yeah.
And again, I want to bring it back to your what you went through in life. Um, and as you said, right, like this can't be the way. This is the way my story is, and his story is ending. How is this the way he's ending? But the one thing I do want to bring up, and I know I've just said a lot of stuff, the one thing I do want to say is that you said that he lived such an adventurous, full life, um, and that he was this kid that knew what he wanted, and it just brings me back to kind of picturing him, and then seeing you guys there, and I can't even again comprehend it. So, did you start yelling at the police officers?
No. Yeah, no, I mean that's a fair question for sure. I mean, I just realized, first of all, I've always had a very strong sensitivity to what our police officers and first responders go to. So for me, paying them respect is just a normal part of my life. I knew it wasn't their fault. But I was pretty pissed, and when I called the sheriff's department that was in charge of the investigation, I didn't yell, but I was very angry and I was stern. I'm like, I don't understand why is there so much communication confusion on this? And of course, the person I was speaking to that was actually at the office either didn't know anything or just wasn't willing to say, which ultimately is where we're going to go, Juliet. So this is at 1:30. We're back to thinking maybe there's a chance. And then at 3:30 a.m., I received my first call from the sheriff's department. And it was to confirm that they had a coroner on site and that he was officially confirmed as dead.
And how many hours was that after?
So that would have been about 7 hours.
Oh my gosh.
So it was, and of course my in-laws were here. So it was kind of round two of,
right.
of
the,
mhm.
well, I was going to say, I mean, I guess, right. If you think about it from their side, they don't want to say something because if it wasn't him, could you imagine so they have to be very careful in what they're doing. But as the people on the other side, you just want answers now. You want to know, which is devastating.
Yeah. As it turned out, it was actually just a policy, that they would not notify any next of kin until the coroner has put their stamp of approval on it. And so everybody that was on site knew he was dead, from the sheer force of the crash itself. But they just weren't going to tell me until the coroner said, yes, it's official. So that's why a lot of times, when we tell this story, by now we're into Tuesday the 24th, but he officially died on the evening of the 23rd.
Right. And so the boys are still sleeping.
Correct. Yeah.
At this point, and I can't imagine when they wake up how that conversation went.
I had some time, which in retrospect, I'm certainly thankful that they didn't wake up on their own and come out, because that ultimately, I didn't wake them up until 7:30. So that gave me about 4 hours for us to just cry and, process and try to wrap our minds around what had happened, which, we didn't do in that moment. You can't. But at least you have a little bit of time to think. And so what ended up happening was when I brought them out and set them down, of course, it's already, the atmosphere is charged. I'm sure we looked like crap. I can only imagine how puffy our eyes were, and they were bloodshot red and everything else. And, my in-laws being in the living room was not normal for a Tuesday morning, especially with the staff. So they walk out and they know what the heck, what's going on.
They can feel the energy.
They can feel the energy. And so we sat down, and it was just prior to that I really felt like, Juliet, and I can't say this with certainty. So I'm asking your listeners just to kind of bear with me on this, but I felt like, okay, is that what that morning walk was all about? And you've prepared me, God, to have this conversation, but I don't know what to say, and I felt like I got the words. And so I set them down and I looked at them, and actually before I say that, you've done such a beautiful job of helping me tell my story. And so, obviously there were a lot of things that led up to this in terms of us being through tough times. And at this point, me being a pastor for over 15 years when this had happened, I've helped many people. I've been in hospital rooms watching loved ones die in front of their family and, trying to help them afterwards and all those types of things. So I was also, if there was an advantage, I didn't have an advantage with the pain. Nothing will prepare you for that. But I did have an advantage of having some understanding of what turn our lives could take if we didn't go about this carefully.
Right. Well, I mean, also from you just being 12 and starting the story.
Right.
So anyone that's just jumping in now, if you go back to the story that your parents did reconcile years later, but the damage was already done. So you had that in the back of your mind, whether you were thinking it or not. But as you said, you were with all the experience that you had. Now you have to think about, how am I going to protect these two boys who are here on earth, who are, even though you're in this immense, again, probably out of body experience, this pain that you're going through, how do I protect them?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, to that point, before I launch out, that is certainly something that for those of us who have lost a child, when you have more than one, you even though you're in incredible pain, it's challenging or difficult to not immediately think exactly what you just said, that I've got to figure something out quick, because how I frame this and how I help my kids is going to dictate possibly the rest of their lives, And so I was aware of that, And so I just turned to them and I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We have two choices of how we're going to live this out as a family. And I've seen both. The first one is we can choose to focus on the tragedy, the pain of our tragedy, the fact that he died in a plane crash, all of the other obvious things, the milestones, the birthdays, the Christmases, all those things. And not that we weren't going to feel those things, but if we focus on how he died, then we are going to be shadows of who each of us were created to be. And the pain that we're feeling now is going to keep us trapped. And we're not going to live our lives out the way we could have. But there's a second choice. And our second choice, and this is what we're going to do, is we can choose life. And what that meant for me, Juliet, was I said, listen, Gabriel attacked life. I don't need to, repeat to your listeners everything, but I just told the boys, he attacked it. He did all these things. He was always like, what's next? What's next? He was adventurous. And despite the fact that we obviously never wanted to lose him ever, he was in fact living his dream, even in the moment that he passed. And so I told them, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to choose to remember the way he lived. And we're going to honor his life and the way he lived by doing the same in ours. And
right,
we just made that pact. And then part two, which was just as critical, was the grieving side, and I said, so here's the thing. We don't know how it's going to hit us. I don't know how it's going to hit me, mom, you guys. We don't know from one day to the next. And for a while, probably even hour to hour, how we're going to feel. Are we going to be sad? Are we going to be angry? Are we going to feel like we're maybe going into severe depression? All the different things that you're going to have to process going through the grieving process. I said, so here's what we're going to do as well. We are going to do this as a family. And what that looks like is we cannot allow ourselves to isolate. Now, keep in mind, they're only 9 and 14. But I really, even in that moment, felt like I couldn't just tell them what we were going to do. I needed to invite them into what we were going to do.
Well, and you know what? And I think it's so important for, everyone to think about this. And I make the mistakes too. Kids are so much more resilient, but also so much more aware. Mm-hmm. They're so much more aware than we give them credit for. They're so much smarter. They are so much bigger. Yes, they have immature brains. But when I really do feel when things that happen big, sometimes they have more insight because they can not muscle through, that's not the word. They can muddle through.
Yeah.
And be a little bit more. So not telling them, right? Like, oh, this is like sugarcoating it could have pissed them off because they're like, what are you talking about? Like, this is devastating. This is like, what are you talking about? If you're like, okay, we're going, so I think doing that is really an important thing. Any kind of tragedy that you talk to children about, I think sugarcoating it or making it a little less than, they're going to know.
Yeah, I agree. No, and I think, that was what I was sensing. So I just said, listen, so, this is not going to be a two-way, a one-way street where if you're feeling sad or you need to cry or you need to be angry, you need to cuss, because nothing was off limits. There was no emotion that was inappropriate. You're allowed to feel them all. We're not going to stop you. And if I'm crying, mom's not going to stop me. She's not going to come over and she's not going to hug me and tell me, oh, stop, stop, stop. Don't cry. Don't cry. It's going to be okay. We're not going to do that. We're going to support each other and we're going to allow each other to feel whatever emotions we're feeling, to be able to express whatever those emotions are. And it's going to be a two-way street. There's going to be times, and this has happened over the course of the last 3.5 years or so, where I'm the one who's feeling emotional and crying because there's a trigger of some kind. And I'll let them know how I'm feeling and why I'm feeling it. And so we set out, that morning with those two things, this life perspective of honoring him by the way we live, and then that, yes, we are going to have pain. And Juliet, I think we may have talked about this in our brief call. The pain is always going to be there. Our goal has never been to get rid of the pain. To me, the pain represents the love we shared with our son. So it's not about pain.
Right.
I feel pain. But the difference is we had to tell our pain how to behave. We had to tell our pain where to go. Otherwise, it was just going to keep us trapped. And we have not done this perfectly. We're not perfect human beings. We've had weeks or days, whatever, where we didn't execute on this pact we made perfectly. But it gave us something to constantly recalibrate to, so that we could stay focused to continue to live according to those values.
Right. And so I do have to ask you a question, because I know I told you this was going to be an hour show. It is clearly not. So I hope that this is not, I know you're plugging phones in. I had dogs barking. I was like, okay, I know this went, but there's no close. There was no part of your story that I wanted to not know a little bit more. And so I do apologize that it is going long for the listeners. I know they're like, wow, this is your longest show ever. But the story deserves that. The story just does deserve this time. And I do have to ask a question. There's not a question that I haven't asked, even though I know it could take us down a different path. But I do feel that your story is something bigger, and you are going to be able to help so many different people. And what you're doing now because of your story is just, again, going to be, the stories connect us. This is your story. Anyone that's a parent can feel the pain, can feel it. So I do want to ask you, I know when you said you're talking to the boys and it was like, okay, this is how we're going to show up. Do you think that was some of the 12-year-old self talking for when your parents, 12, 13, 14, when your parents went through that? Or do you feel that it was something that you learned in the faith journey, your drug journey?
Yeah.
Or do you think it was a combination?
That's an interesting question. No one has asked me that I can remember. My gut reaction is both. I think there's always been something inside of me that had a prevalence towards resiliency, So I think there's that part that was in me. I think the key difference and why the combination is so critical is having the wisdom to know what that needs to look like. Certainly didn't come from that 12-year-old, but I think both.
Well, but also you see, and again, I could be putting words in your mouth, but your tragedy as a kid is different than the tragedy that your sons are going through. And you can't, again, as we talked about, you can't say that one's bigger than another, because it happened to each person. So you don't know how they are going to handle it. But again, something just innate, I'm sure, even if it's back around in back of your mind, not in the back of your mind, you're protecting that 12-year-old boy of you, right? Maybe you wish that your parents handled it a little different and you wouldn't have gone down that path. Now, that path you were meant to do, right? That path you were meant to do. So it's not going to change it. It's who you are. It's how you're handling this. It's how you're going to help so many masses of people with your story, with your book, with your coaching business. But I wonder how much of that little, 12-year-old boy was like, I gotta be better. I want these two not to have
Yeah.
to, God again has their path. So you can't change their story because of something you're going to say, but you can help shape it.
Yeah. I think I'm still probably answering that question, for myself, to be totally candid with you. Because I think even in the
Yeah.
personal development space, you know, and having helped coach, mentor people for so many years, I think that's true about all of us. I think there are things that whether it's a trauma, whether it's just the way our lives were set up, but there's things that we do carry forward from our childhood, even if it's on a subconscious level, that ends
Yep.
up causing some automated responses to things. And then, hopefully, when you've grown and you've become more mature and you've learned healthier coping mechanisms and you're full of more wisdom, that you can kind of marry those two in a sense, and be more productive for your own life, and be better positioned to help other people.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I do want to, because as I said, I know we're going to have you back on. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. And if your wife, if
I
your wife
apologize. I'm getting
would is what,
bugged by someone who's got an appointment at 2 o'clock.
oh my gosh, I'm so
It's
sorry. Oh my
okay.
gosh. Oh
I
my
didn't
God.
even realize we talked that long. It's been amazing.
My eyes are not good. And I knew that we had technical difficulties in the beginning.
Yeah.
And so I was like calculating and I'm like, oh my gosh. But again, there was no time for me to stop you because we needed this whole part.
Yeah.
I truly believe this whole part needs to be, explored. And so take us into the book though, when you decided to do the book and the coaching business, and then you can tell your client, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So ultimately, 3 months after Gabriel passed, COVID hit. So the whole world got turned on its head, just a few months into it. So obviously during that time, the hardest thing for us to process through is Gabriel, but it wasn't the only thing. And I think for me, I knew I was going to write a book someday, Juliet, but I didn't plan on it being within only a couple of years. I had no timetable. It wasn't like a goal or anything, to just get out a book as fast as I could, And so it took a couple of years, and then I just saw so much fear unleashed on this planet. And this is not a political statement, it's just a fact. There's been
Yeah.
so much fear, so many people feeling hopeless, like there's maybe nothing to look forward to or work towards. And, I just realized that, and a lot of loss in different forms. I just realized that, with my story, and this book, doesn't include just the story of Gabriel. It's got a lot of other stories, including other individuals' stories that will blow your mind and really inspire you. I just realized the world needs something, and so that's why I decided to go ahead and write the book when I did, which was just about a year ago now, or begin writing it about a year ago. And it was just with the idea that I just wanted to help people see that, life is going to punch us all in the gut. We're all going to go through ups and downs. We're all eventually going to die, right? I mean, we all know that. And we're going to
Mm.
suffer seeing loved ones die at some point. But there's so much more to the world, and we're going to miss out on opportunities if we allow fear to cripple us, and if we're not willing to take risks. And for me, one of those things, and how I was inspired by Gabriel, was I thought about launching a coaching business on the side for years. I thought about writing a book for years too, for that matter. But I'd always let excuses, fear, doubt, all those things keep me from doing it. So I decided that I need to write the book, and I wrote it intentionally to help one person. Howard Behar is the gentleman who's on my forward. He's the former president of Starbucks International. And so what Howard told me before I started writing the book, he said, write it for one person.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, I can do that. So I wrote it for one person, but I also wrote it for me at the same time,
Right.
And so ultimately that's, where that went with the book. And now it's the official launch date was yesterday. So that's available, everywhere books are sold, and people can go to my website at bigboldbrave.us to check out everything else about me too. But I've just made it my mission in life to help as many people along the way as I can. Yes, learn how to push through pain and, keep your family healthy, your marriage healthy, all those things, but also to live your dream, and don't allow circumstances of life to dictate to you how you're going to live a mediocre life. Because the fact is, the data shows most people on the planet hate what they're doing.
Yeah.
They do. And they're not courageous enough to do something about it. And only you can do that. Nobody's ever going to do it for you. So that's just part of why I wrote the book and what I'm hoping people will be inspired to do. My tagline is courageous humans, inspiring lives. My whole life now is dedicated to finding courageous people, which courage is in every single one of us, and doing my part, whatever little part that may be, to help inspire them to be inspiring. I don't want to go and talk in front of hundreds of thousands of people and them all walk away going, wow, he's really inspiring, and not walk out going, what am I going to do to be inspiring? That's what matters.
Yeah, no, and I love that. And I think it's a brilliant message. And Gabriel's definitely there surrounding himself around you, being like, I know you can do it. And
Absolutely.
not only, but you also took other positions, right? We talked about this throughout this episode. You took positions with blind faith. I'm jumping into here. I'm jumping into here.
Yep.
So the fact that you didn't jump into the book and the coaching business fascinates me. We're going to talk about that at a different time because I have a lot of questions with that, but I'm not going to jump into it. But it fascinates me when people are so big and brave in one moment,
right,
and then there's something that holds them back.
Yep.
And I do think it's a timing thing. But then I also am always like very curious of like why and what leads that. But I think timing is one of the things, and I think experience is another thing. It's just not the time that it's supposed to happen. But I just have to say thank you so much for joining your next Stop Live. As I said, we're going to have you on again because I definitely want to talk more. We're going to follow everyone. Please go to bigboldbrave.us, US, or us, right?
I like
I want to
that.
make sure I'm saying this right. And I actually, that's so true. I love that with us because it is what you're doing. You're helping others. You're inspiring others from so many different tragedies that you had in your life to so many also of the big wins that you've had in life. You have so much to teach and so much to share. And people need to hear it, especially as you said now with the, with all the fear. It's your time.
Yeah.
It is your time, and I want everyone to write down Clint Hatton's name and his website, bigboldbrave.us or .us, because you're going to be hearing a lot more from Clint.
Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm so sorry that we went so long. I haven't even calculated it in my mind.
Yeah, it's all right.
No, your story, there's no way as we were having the conversation, there is ways that you can, as a storyteller, concise things that, but this needed to be laid out the way it was.
Thank you.
Really, really do. And I wish you all the luck. And I know we're going to be connected. And thank you guys, everyone, for joining your next Stop Live here on Fireside. Please go follow Clint. And thank you